Over the course of the 1920s, the United States was inundated with a flood of prosperity. The economy flourished in the years following World War I, and the country's wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929. These roaring 20s were characterized by excess, including extensive production, substantial consumerism, and, in particular, rampant stock speculation. Anyone, from the richest millionaire to the poorest factory worker, could choose to pour their savings into the stock market, resulting in stock prices that seemed to endlessly spiral upwards. In stark contrast to the prosperity of the United States, numerous other countries were struggling with immense debt from World War I. The United States was one of the largest creditors, but many nations were unable to pay them back in full. Additionally, war-torn Germany was on the brink of anarchy as the British and French demanded that they pay $32 billion in war reparations. In order to prevent a breakdown of the international finance system, Congress proposed and implemented the Dawes Plan. This plan opened up further opportunities for Americans to forward more private loans to Germany. This allowed Germany to pay its reparations to France and Britain, who in turn could pay their war debts to the United States. This set up a dangerous circle of financing, where the United States' credit was the sole source of money. If its credit came crashing down, there would be no supporting nation to pick up the slack, resulting in an augmented catastrophic worldwide depression. However, with the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties in full swing, and the stock market prices steadily climbing, this could never possibly occur, right? In October 1929, the buoyant stock market bubble popped, sending the economy crashing down. The British had raised their interest rates in an attempt to earn back money being sent abroad to American investors. In response, foreign investors and American speculators began to frantically sell their stocks. This culminated in the Black Tuesday of October 29, 1929, when 16,410,030 shares of stock were desperately sold. By the end of 1929, 2 months after the start of the crash, stockholders had lost $40 billion. So began the longest and most intense depression in American, or world, history, the Great Depression. Despite the rampant riches that characterized the 1920s, innumerable American farmers were faced with immense debt and hardship due to increased competition abroad and decreasing prices on farm produce. Various legislation over the course of the 1920s attempted to alleviate this problem, but were largely unsuccessful. As such, in 1930, the House of Representatives introduced the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which was originally a reasonable protective measure designed to aid the farmers. However, by the time lobbyists had pushed it through the Senate, it acquired about 1,000 amendments, turning it into the highest protective tariff in the nation's peacetime history. The duty on goods was raised from an average of 38.5% in 1922 to nearly 60%. This intense tariff angered other countries, who viewed it as an unnecessary trade measure and the start of economic warfare. In response, they raised their own tariffs in order to protect their own economies, inevitably causing the worldwide depression to dramatically worsen. Following Black Tuesday and the implementation of the disastrous Hawley-Smoot Tariff, the depression continued to worsen. By the end of 1930, more than 4 million American workers were unemployed. 1 year later, that number had increased by 2 million. By 1933, when the Depression hit its lowest point, 15 million workers were unemployed. Additionally, over 5,000 banks collapsed during the first 3 years of the Depression, taking the life savings of tens of thousands of citizens with them. By 1933, nearly half the country's banks had failed. Foreclosures increased exponentially, leading to the creation of Hoovervilles, or cobbled-together shantytowns, where homeless people slept under newspapers and cooked their scant food in old oil drums. Despite the widespread desperation and willingness to work, there were no jobs to be had, as factories and jobs folded from lack of funds, leaving millions of Americans and their families to struggle through unemployment and homelessness. The president during the start of the Depression was a Republican by the name of Herbert Hoover. He was a fierce proponent of free enterprise. As such, he shrank from the idea of government handouts. However, as the Depression worsened and relief by local government agencies broke down, Hoover was forced to intervene. As a result, he decided to assist the beleaguered railroads, banks, and credit corporations in the hope that the restoration of financial stability at the top of the economy would trickle down to provide employment at the bottom. Hoover also managed to push Congress to pass a few relieving acts and committees, but was ultimately unsuccessful in effectively relieving the Depression. Unemployment was still high, and innumerable Americans were still homeless. It would take the election of a new president, one who was more willing to support government intervention in the lives of its citizens, in order for the Depression to finally wane. The presidential election of 1932 saw two prominent candidates go head-to-head: incumbent Republican Herbert Hoover and Democratic hopeful Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hoover ran on a platform in favor of free enterprise and individual initiative. He predicted that, if the Smoot Tariff was repealed, industry would break down. In stark contrast to Hoover's slightly gloomy promises, Roosevelt ran on a more optimistic platform. He promised a New Deal for the common man and assured his supporters that he would balance the budget, all while berating the Hoover administration's deficits. At the same time, he pledged to utilize more government money in order to relieve the effects of the Depression. Ultimately, Roosevelt's promises of sweeping economic and social reforms triumphed over Hoover's platform. Roosevelt won a sweeping victory with 22,809,638 votes against Hoover's 15,758,901. The electoral count resulted in 472 votes for Roosevelt and 59 for Hoover. As such, a new president arrived at the White House in the midst of the greatest depression in the nation's history. The question was, how would he relieve it? Roosevelt was inaugurated on March 4, 1933, and almost immediately declared a national banking holiday from March 6 to March 10 in order to open the banks later on a sounder basis. He then summoned Congress into a special session to address the Depression. The 100 Days Congress quickly created numerous programs with the intent to fulfill the New Deal's three goals: relief, recovery, and reform. One of the first significant acts passed by Congress was the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. This program allowed the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure all individual deposits up to $5,000, and effectively ended the previously persistent plague of U.S. bank failures. Additionally, Roosevelt took the United States off of the gold standard and had private stores of gold confiscated. The inflationary result increased the amount of paper money in circulation, but protesters caused Roosevelt to return to the gold standard on a limited scale in 1934 for international trade only. With the banks stabilized, the 100 Days Congress turned their attention to relieving unemployment. When Roosevelt took office, 1 out of every 4 Americans was unemployed. Congress responded to this by creating the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. This program recruited about 3 million young men in government camps, employing them to engage in useful open-air jobs such as reforestation, firefighting, flood control, and swamp drainage. The young men were required to send most of their pay home to their parents, thus helping numerous citizens slowly recover from homelessness and lack of money. While many programs prioritized recovery, the Federal Emergency Relief Act focused on immediate relief. It ultimately granted $3 billion for payments and wages for federal employees. As such, with the country starting to stabilize, the Roosevelt administration could focus more on long-term recovery programs. The National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, was implemented to assist industry and the unemployed. It reduced hours of labor so that more people could be employed, created a maximum amount of hours of labor permitted, and established minimum wage. Perhaps most importantly, laborers were finally granted the right to organize and bargain collectively, a goal that labor organizations have been fighting for over the course of many decades. Additionally, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA, prioritized the recovery of the nation's hard-hit farmers. It eliminated surpluses in farm produce, and thus the subsequent deflation in their value, by paying farmers to reduce the number of acres they farmed. Other groups were assisted by the programs of the Roosevelt administration as well. In 1935, the Social Security Act created government-backed unemployment insurance in order to avoid future severe depressions. It also provided security for elderly Americans, with qualified citizens receiving regular monetary aid from the federal government. By 1935, most of the immediate recovery programs had been implemented, allowing the nation to start to claw its way out of the Great Depression. The last of the arguably most notable acts was the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which created the National Labor Relations Board to administer over labor and reaffirm the right of workers to organize and bargain collectively. Following 1935, and as a result of conflict with the Supreme Court and with anti-New Deal protesters, the New Deal began to wind down. Roosevelt and Congress still kept a close eye on the recovering country, even as certain protesters argued that the New Deal had been a costly, wasteful, and ineffective endeavor. Despite these arguments, the New Deal undoubtedly assisted the United States in starting to struggle its way out of the vicious depression. However, it would take several more years and the prosperous industry of war for the grasping tendrils of the Great Depression to finally fade away.